Welcome to Meatballs with Jim Putnam. This video is going to be all about meatballs, okay? This is a Forsythia meatball, very common around our neighborhood here in Raleigh, North Carolina. You can see that they've recently meatballed it, so it has a perfect, just an absolutely perfect meatball shape. The leaves are burning a bit on it because they've uncovered some foliage that wasn't used to the sunlight, so it's burned a bit over here. So we'll get a patch of flowers here maybe in the spring. Maybe we'll get a patch of flowers here, and we'll get a patch of flowers here. It's very decorative, okay, how these things bloom in the spring after they've been meatballed, okay? You'll get just a few here and there. We wouldn't want it to actually come into full flower, would we? We would want it to just be patchy. But jokes aside, this is a plant that definitely, you know, it's about putting the plant in the right space. It's right here next to the sidewalk. These want to get 12 or 15 feet tall and have a big arching habit, something like that, depending on the variety of Forsythia. There's much more compact ones now, for sure, but just at the point where it was put in the ground here, it just kind of wrote its future as a meatball, right? Once it went in the ground, it was either going to be flat sheared, which is another version of this in the neighborhood to keep it off the sidewalk, or it was going to be meatballed. So we're going to go around the neighborhood and show you some expert meatballing this morning. When we started this meatball journey this morning, I did not expect to find a meatball tacuba, but this is another example of when you take this foliage off in the middle of summer, pruning it several times a year, that it just burns on the top. But this is a gold dust tacuba that really in between these windows probably could be allowed to get a little bit of height on it, but whatever the landscaper is that they hire here to come in and do this, meatball expert, okay? He's got a graduate degree in meatballing, and everything in this garden is meatballs. It's meatball time. Meatballs. These are not very good meatballs. Not at all. I think we've seen much better meatballs out in the landscapes today.
We're gonna have to search for some better meatballs.
Yes, we are gonna have to search for some better meatballs. There's some Nandina over there that have been more boxed off than meatballed. And then there's a ligustrum here, definitely been meatballed. This would probably have been a better candidate to be limbed up into a small tree, right here on the corner of the house, but instead it was, just cut down repeatedly as a meatball. Now this is an invasive plant, and so the fact that they're meatballing it after it flowers is probably preventing some seed from happening. So maybe in that regard, it's being this is a beneficial meatball. But again, it was cut off the top here, right in the middle of a night. We're in a drought, and it's 90 some degrees outside. So as soon as the foliage comes off of it, every time it's getting burned, it's being cooked off, and it's definitely, obviously not happy about it. And it's not, again, right plant, right place. So this is another invasive. This is actually an Elaeagnus that's, these get really, really tall. I mean, we've seen these as big as 20 feet tall in some wooded spaces around the neighborhood where they've seeded in. So this is probably beneficial, again, that they're being cut several times a year so that they're not producing any seed, but definitely this is not a good plant necessarily. This is, you could use these as a screening plant, but right up here by, the entryway to the front of the house, they're having to prune on them just basically multiple times a year. This plant, with the root system it has on it, can probably grow 6 feet in a single season, maybe more. So there's no telling how many times they're having to actually prune these in a year. This is a barberry, kind of an interesting barberry, but again, it's turned in, they're constantly pruning. One thing about some of these things we've seen, sometimes you can turn, like backing up to that ligustrum, it could be tree formed on the corner of that house and maybe turned into something that's actually interesting. The other technique we could use when these plants, because these plants don't necessarily have an off switch, so there is some point where you're going to have to do some pruning on things. No matter what plant it is, it's going to keep growing potentially. You might be better off reset pruning them and really pruning them hard, back to the ground and letting them come back in some sort of free form for a little while. All of this pruning can create some suckering, so you'll probably have to go in and prune out some suckers, but there may be better techniques than trying to hold them at the exact height you want to hold them. Because the problem is, if this is the exact height I want this plant, as soon as it starts growing, it's now bigger than I wanted it. So I'm almost ready to prune it again. So taking it down a little bit lower than you want to keep it might at least buy you, a season or two, before you're having to prune on them just constantly like this. These dwarf Yopon hollies, frequently on a tag, you'd see they say 3 to 4 feet in height, 3 to 4 feet in width, something like that. There's one in the neighborhood that's 6 to 7 feet tall. It's definitely taller than I am and wider than I am. So again, they don't necessarily have off switches. I actually kind of like what they did with this group of dwarf Yopon hollies. They've turned it into just kind of a single piece in a nice little formal space. It looks intentional. It looks a little less like, oh no, it gets bigger than I thought it was gonna get, and let me hold it at that height forever. These actually kind of look nice. And one other thing on pruning is they've also angled the edges on them, allowing light to get down to the bottom. So if I prune these things square down like this, which you'll see a lot of these kinds of boxing off things, then the light can't get down to the bottom and you'll see some thinning, but you see how full these are right down to the ground. So I definitely want to point out in this video that we have lots of things in this garden that would be considered meatballish. They grow in kind of a dome shape or a formal shape all on their own. We've got dwarf Indian Hawthorne right here. I've got a boxwood right here beside me. We've got a Abelia and other things that are meant to kind of be perfect little domes in the garden, because we use so many things that are kind of free-formed out here. We're tree forming things, and we're doing lots of interesting things. So I think it is important to maybe have some plants in the garden that are unchangeable, throughout the year. That just, again, just kind of gives something for the eye to rest on in the garden. But, it's about right place, the right plant in the right place. This Indian Hawthorne is going to stay like this without me having to prune on it all the time to keep it this way. The boxwood, the same thing. The Abelia, the same thing. So we're, again, using these little formal shapes out here, but putting the right plant in keeps me from having to do so much maintenance on it. Some of these other things we're showing you around the neighborhood are requiring, pruning 2, 3, 4 times a year in order to keep them like that, and you're probably sacrificing flowers in the process. We were looking down here headed to something else, and then we passed this. This is a special kind of meatballing. These are northern sea oats, grasses that have been basically meatballed just in the middle of season. Cut them down like that. There's an azalea next to it that's just been absolutely flat topped. There's a Abelia back here, same thing, just completely flat topped and then allowed to kind of burn. And then a super weird one right here is a poet's laurel. Poet's laurel kind of grows in this really, stays low like this, but usually grows in kind of an open form. It's got a cherry and a couple other things growing up through it, but that's a poet's laurel that's actually been turned into a meatball for some reason. We have new Laurel Pedum that will stay smaller than this, but this is obviously an old one. It's been here for a long time, and it's kind of been turned into a meatball. I don't know if this is a meatball shape, right? This is some other shape. This Laurel Pedum will probably bloom very little. It's going to have it's going to have to be pruned so many times a year. Once they get a root system on it, this thing probably has a root system on it of a 20-foot tall Laurel Pedum. I mean, it's an old variety, probably easily gets that tall. We saw one down in Georgia recently, which was probably 30 feet tall plus. But once it has a root system like this thing will grow like this much a month during the growing season. So it's just going to constantly have to be pruned like this. Here's a Clayera, and I don't know which variety this is. There are some Clayera that stay a little smaller. This one's been here a long time, so I'm guessing it's one that gets quite big. So it was put here to be a tall, narrow thing, and then over the years they just started cutting it, and here it is. I guess this is not so much a meatball, it's just, as Steph said, it's kind of heavily manipulated, let's call it that. But it's not taking on any of the characteristics of what makes Clayera interesting with the kind of red new foliage. Every time this thing gets any new foliage on it, it's off with its head. Here's a winter honeysuckle. This is another invasive, so I guess cutting it after it flowers in the spring, not that it's going to do a whole lot of flowering cut like this, but a little bit of fragrant flowers that you do get on like February in our area on these. I guess cutting them after will prevent them from seeding. But this is another one of those big free-form plants like Forsythia that just look great when they're allowed to just kind of come into that full form. So you're really better off taking this thing down to about 18 inches in height and then letting it grow out for 2 or 3 years in that kind of free form, and then taking it down again to the ground rather than trying to box it off. This thing can grow probably 4 feet in a single season. So there's no telling how many times they're actually having to come through in a year and box this row off. All right, so I've never tried meatball pizza.
Me neither.
Okay, well, let's see.
I'm not sure we're going to try it this time either. Not a whole lot of meatballs.
All right.
All right, cheers.
Cheers. Meatball pizza. It's not bad. I think maybe we can do better. Okay. All right.
Let's do better for dinner.
Okay. All right. Let's do it.
Meatballs take 3.
There are a lot of different Distillium on the market, different shapes and all different shapes and sizes, from really, really short varieties to really, really tall and narrow varieties. Whatever. I don't know what this one is. It was planted on campus, but you can see right now they've allowed it to go about a month or 2 without pruning it, and it's back into kind of a little bit of its natural shape, and looks okay. But I can see down in here where they're repeatedly coming through and just pruning them back into that same size over and over and over again. Probably if this one right here was just removed and maybe placed a little further over, those 2 right there at the top of this little wall would be fine staying where they are and allowed to grow out into their kind of natural weeping shape. And then when you cut it, you can cut it much harder and then go a couple seasons and allow its natural form again to take place. But the way this is, it's building a bigger and bigger root system, which means it grows faster and faster. And so you're fighting harder and harder to try to keep it in that meatball shape. This one's kind of funny. This is a weeping Japanese maple, and it's been pruned to fit this shape between these 2 rails and these 2 sidewalks over the years. Every limb that's come out past it, they've cut on it, and it's actually turned it into this really interesting contorted shape. I don't know how many years this actually took, but this is a single tree from the center there. It's probably 12, 15 feet wide and maybe 6 feet deep, but this one is actually kind of interesting, right? But it's also, I don't know. Tell me what you think in the comments down below about the Japanese maple that's been pruned into this shape. Definitely want to point out here that we're not anti-meatball. I mean, this variegated boxwood is a great example of a meatball that we've done with intent. Bought it as a clearance plant, limbed it up into a little meatball. There's a 2-ball meatball out in the front garden that's quite decorative, that's in a container. We have things like this dragon prince cryptomeria, which the grapevine is trying to eat. I need to limb that up a bit, but you can see I haven't had to prune it. So it's a meatball. It's a meatball without maintenance. That's the meatballs that I would like to have out here in the garden. Eventually, like I said, nothing has an off switch. So at some point, that plant's going to get big enough that I'm going to need to make a decision to prune it, and I'll probably try to prune it back hard enough that I don't have to prune it again, for a little while. The Mojo Pittosporum right there, which there's 3 more of in the back. This October Magic Ruby Camellia is kind of a meatball, kind of a meatball shape to it. So we have plenty of meatballs, out here, and there's never been a video ever with the word meatball in it as many times as it is, but it's always been a joke to me. Is what I've always called them, when I see, entire landscapes, full of meatballs. So we're definitely not anti-meatball. We just think that there's probably, you can find some vertical elements, some leaf shape differences, find some space for some things that you can allow to grow and become, what they're kind of supposed to look like, whether they have a weeping habit or an open habit or, whatever the habit is of that particular shrub. And you don't have to meatball the things that don't want to be meatballed. Here are Itea meatballed. This is another one that has the normal kind of open weeping habit. I don't think it'll ever have as many flowers. It had a few flowers on it, I can see, but it'll never have as many as it should have. This is a disconnect between a landscape designer and then a maintenance company that ended up putting the low bid on this apartment complex, because these Fastigiate Plum yews, were probably meant to be little soldiers out here a little bit taller. These were probably meant to actually maybe even grow in between these a bit. Laurel Pedum here. I don't know what the purpose of this was. This was probably should have been a smaller growing variety, but everything on this entire apartment complex is plants that will either get too big for the space, or there's a lack of understanding maybe about how they would actually grow if they were just left to grow on their own. But basically they just come through here and say, everything gets to be 2 feet tall, and that's the way it is. Lots of these taller growing laurels all over the neighborhood that are boxed off like this or turned into round shapes. This one is an upright growing one. It was put in this corner next to this brick and on this siding to be tall. But again, the landscaper, you know, just knows one thing, and that's off with its head. How about a meatballed Osmanthus? I don't think you're gonna get many flowers on this one. Again, I don't know, you know, when these landscape architects they have very limited space to plant around these new kinds of apartment buildings that we see, these 4 and 5 story apartment buildings. So, you know, I don't know what they had in mind here. I mean, this could be definitely, you know, allowed to grow some height on it, or maybe it should have been Goshiki Osmanthus, which would have just naturally stayed smaller. I really don't know. I have no idea, but now forever, this is what this Osmanthus is going to look like out here. And again, it's going to develop growth faster and faster and faster. And so it's going to have to be, you know, this is going to have to be done multiple times a year to keep this look. This is a plant that probably gets 30 feet tall. And I don't know, maybe if it was here, it could have gone up the brick, you know, up the side of the building here, because there is a spot between the window and this porch rail. Maybe if it was centered a bit over here, it could have blocked the downspout and been allowed to actually grow up, but was centered back this way, and so it's going to block that window if it's allowed to grow. And these get 25 feet tall, and so imagine, you know, how hard this is going to be to keep this looking like this. You know, at some point it'll just have to come out, you know. And again, if it was placed at a slightly different placement with this plant would have allowed it to do what it does, which is a beautiful, lustrous evergreen shrub that grows naturally upright and wouldn't need to be pruned. I feel like these 5 abelia were planted here with the intent of filling up this space and limiting the amount of maintenance that would be done here. But instead, you know, the maintenance crew has decided to just keep turning them into small balls, which is allowing, you know, ivy to creep up the bank underneath them, and is actually making, you know, you've got bare soil, so it's washing out on the sidewalk, and, you know, it's not, if they just let these 5 abelia just kind of fill this space and take it over, you know, the pollinators would enjoy it too, because they should be in full flower right now. And there's a couple flowers on this one that haven't been cut as hard, but those have virtually no flowers. Okay. All right, so these are homemade meatballs with tomatoes from the garden.
Yes.
Okay, nice.
All right. Our last meatballs of the day.
Yeah, last meatballs.
We'll see if these are our favorite meatballs.
Okay, all right. Let's try it. Let's try it. They're probably better than the sub and the pizza. I can't imagine. They wouldn't be.
They were kind of disappointing, to be honest. Not these.
That was good. There you go. All right, the best meatballs. Here's that dwarf Yopon holly that I was talking about. I'm 6 feet tall and this thing's 6.5 feet tall. I don't know how tall it would be. This is another one of those plants that the tag's gonna say 3 to 4 feet, 3 to 4 feet. That's what I said earlier. And look how big it actually is. These plants don't have an off switch. So there is gonna be times in the future where no matter how careful you've been putting a plant in, you know, picking the spot for it, it's gonna need some work. But what my thought on something like this is, rather than trying to keep it the exact right size, the perfect, you know, shape off the sidewalk and the perfect height, that I'd rather take the thing down much further and buy myself a couple seasons of not having to prune on it. These also get kind of a wine color on the new foliage, and you're just never going to be able to enjoy that as well. So for me, I just take the thing down harder. And again, this video is meant to be a joke. We're not the police of landscaping in any way, shape, or form. We've eaten meatballs 3 times in the same day to make a joke of this. But, you know, again, trying to pick the right plants. I have total appreciation for plants kept in certain shapes to kind of settle the eye in a landscape of different other textures and shapes and weeping forms and all of those kinds of things. It's just that a lot of times we see plants that, you know, were planted in poor site selection for that plant has led it to be pruned on all the time and it's never been the thing that you bought it for. Maybe you bought it for purple foliage, maybe you bought it for flowers, maybe you bought it for whatever you bought it for. It now no longer is necessarily going to have those things, the attributes that you bought the plant for when you purchased it. So picking the right spot, and then when you're thinking about pruning, you know, for me, I would rather reset prune and allow something to come back for a couple seasons and allow it to have those attributes that I bought it for, and then do that again, you know, all at once. And I could chip this material up and use it as the mulch underneath itself, you know, without any problem. But I thought it would be interesting to see at the end of the video here, a dwarf Yaupon holly doing what it will ultimately do if it's in the ground long enough. Thank you guys for watching.